So I've been checking out these Sunday shows, and not just the Sunday shows, but the last couple of weeks of the news. And you would think that as it pertains to Afghanistan, there was no George W. Bush, no Barack Obama, no Donald Trump, that everything that's going wrong in Afghanistan right now is all the fault of Joe Biden. Now, I'm not a military planner, so I'm sure there's things that could have been done better, but let's just lay out some things um, that I think need to be said. This ain't going to be short, I'm sorry, but we got to go back to the beginning of this. And there's going to be a narrative, I would argue, of Democratic presidents having to come behind Republican presidents and clean up their mess. But all of this started with Ronald Reagan. It started with the Cold War when Afghanistan was at war with Russia, the Soviet Union at the time. And we funded the Mujahideen, the fighters who were, the people who were fighting against the Russians. The Mujahideen later became what is essentially the Taliban. So the Taliban came into power in the 1990s. They hadn't been in power 10 years when George W. Bush invaded Afghanistan. So about the Afghanistan invasion, I know most Americans at the time were gung-ho about let's go, but I was one of those Barbalese of the world who was like, nah. I say this because if you followed what was going on back then outside of the hooray media, which was basically everybody for the most part, except for like Democracy Now! And a handful of other primarily progressive reporters, the Taliban had been trying to turn over the leadership of Al Qaeda. Remember, Al Qaeda is who masterminded the September 11th, 2001 bombings. The Taliban harbored them in their country, let them train there. So the whole idea was to go in and get rid of them, make Afghanistan free of a terrorist training ground. So just before that, again, the Talibani government was willing to give up Al Qaeda. Bush said, no, it's too late. So we invaded. Okay. So we invaded, we're there. It didn't take long to defeat the Taliban, but then we start morphing into nation building. And I'm not saying that the plight of women and girls and other people in Afghanistan should not be a concern. But if that's the case, and this gets into the whole argument of the world police, there's countries all over the world, sub-Saharan Africa, throughout the Western Asia, Southeast Asia, South America. There's places all over the world, Southeast Asia, all over the world, where women and girls are treated like crap. We're not in all of those countries because we can't be. And again, I'm not trying to belittle their plight because I understand I'm lucky to have been born here in this country with all of its warts. But we can't police the world. So what became, we're going to get rid of the Taliban and make sure that Afghanistan can't harbor terrorists, became a nation building thing. And as we're doing that, actually just before we start to do the big nation building is when George Bush lies us into the war in Iraq and pulls most of the troops out of Afghanistan and sends them to Iraq. That was the linchpin right there, because whatever the goals were could have been achieved with manpower. Sent all those people to Iraq. Okay, that's the focus now, Iraq. The same type of crap that we did in Iraq, and unfortunately America has done throughout its history in the Cold War, is we propped up a government. And we propped up a government that didn't have popular local support. We did that again with the government in Iraq. We saw what happened. Obama had to come in and clean that up as far as getting our troops out. And gee, what did the Republicans do? Oh yeah, it's Obama's fault, he created ISIS. Forgetting that George W. Bush lied us into that war. Okay. So we go forward in time. Now, I'm not excusing Barack Obama, because Barack Obama ran on and knew that he needed to end the war in Afghanistan. He got the military generals and advisors in his ear telling him the situation isn't right, let's stay, let's surge. He did that. And another thing is, he, like every other president, they don't want the optics, and I know some people don't like this word, the optics are all those people hanging off the airplane that the news likes to focus on. And when you hear, especially Republican critics, they like to focus on that. So yeah, it is about optics, not about the actuality on the ground. But Obama didn't want to have those optics in his presidency, so he didn't make the hard decision. Let's do this thought experiment for a minute. The same type of voices, a lot of times military people who fought on the ground there, who are talking about how disgraceful it is and people dying in vain. If you go back to 1975, you heard the same arguments from people who were saying we should stay in Vietnam. Look, everybody wasn't like we should get out of Vietnam. The same type of voices that you hear now saying we should still be in Afghanistan, not the exact same people because of age, but the same political ideology, you heard the same things in 75. I don't recall anybody arguing that in 1980, 1985, we should have still been in Vietnam. This is what people are talking about here in Afghanistan. So let's fast forward in time. So Barack Obama didn't do the pullout like he should have. What do we have next? Donald Trump. Now, I want you guys, because you don't like to listen to liberals and progressives. So go back to your own news sources and rewind the clock, not to today, what people are saying today when they rewrite history, but go back and read and watch these interviews these people gave in February of 2020 when Donald Trump signed this deal with the Taliban. So what led up to Donald Trump signing this deal with the Taliban? The guy, Baradar, I may be saying his last name incorrectly. He's one of the co-creators of the Taliban. This guy, the CIA captured him 10 years ago, was in jail in Pakistan. Donald Trump pushed to have him released so that he could negotiate with him. Not him, the leadership of Afghanistan and the Taliban. No, just Trump's people, the Taliban. Why is this important? I touched on it, what propped up governments. The Afghani people didn't pick this government. This government, the airport is named after Hamid Karzai. He didn't have a strong political backing on the ground there. We put him in. So we put him in control of a country where many times the people more so relied on their family unit, their town, their village, their area, their ethnic group. Now, to have a government that all those people are going to support has to come from them on the ground, not hoisted upon them. So it's not when people are saying they didn't want to fight the Civil War for their freedom, it's not to say that it's not calling these people cowards. When you dig into it, really what it comes down to, this wasn't a government they believed in. So we were asking these people to fight for a government that they did not believe in, did not ask for, did not want. Okay, so Trump, February 2020. So that's established. He pushes to have the guy released. They start their negotiating. In this deal, what Trump negotiates, Doha, February 2020, is, hey, don't attack American soldiers and troops on the ground. Don't harbor terrorists, and we'll leave. He didn't say don't attack the Afghani government no, don't attack Americans. And Trump set the timeline. Now remember, February 2020 is when he signed this deal. And again, go back, read, look at the interviews of all these Republicans who are now acting like this stuff just happened under Biden. Look at what they said about Trump and how they congratulated Trump for that Doha agreement. Okay, so there were a handful of critics on the Republican side, don't get me wrong. But by and large, oh, great thing. Look what our president has done. So another thing in that deal, it required that 5,000 Taliban fighters be released and 1,000 Afghan fighters in exchange. 1,000 for 5,000. The other thing Trump did with this agreement, at that time there were over 12,000 United States troops in Afghanistan. Donald Trump reduced that number down to 2,500. And then said, okay, well, we're not going to set this deadline to get out in 2020 because we got to see conditions on the ground. We'll set it for May of 2021. Okay. If you remember, people were telling you guys that when Donald Trump and his administration would not do a proper transition with Joe Biden, there was information that the Biden administration was not getting things they needed to know. This was part of that stuff. So when Biden took office on January 27th, they had no knowledge of all the different details and inner workings of what Trump was doing because they weren't communicating. So now they got to figure out what's going on in Afghanistan, what's going on in all parts of the government while this pandemic is going on. And the fallout from January 6th. You have to remember, all this is going on. When Biden gets into office and he starts to recognize what these plans are in April of 2021. Now remember, Trump said that the get out date was going to be May, I think it was May 2nd. So in March or April, the Biden administration started to tell Americans then, get out of Afghanistan. We are going to pull out. He moved the date to September 11th, 2021. You know, the final day, and then we want to have most people out by the 31st. Final day was supposed to be September 11th. That was negotiated to try, not negotiated, but Biden changed that timeline to try to have a more cohesive plan on the ground. Now, what was happening during this time, when between Doha 2020 and today, the Taliban started negotiating with these different rural groups of fighters. Hey, we won't attack you guys. Just give us your weapons. Yeah, we're good. And they start making these deals, paying people off. So you folks, they're making you think that these people fought their way into Kabul and surrounded the Americans at the airport. That's not what happened. The Afghanis didn't fight in most cases. Most cases, there was no fighting. The Taliban just rolled in. So most of those people you saw hanging off that airplane, those weren't these people they talk about, these special immigrant visa people that work with Americans. No, most of those were general, regular Afghanis because the so-called president and his government just bounced and left the country. So those people were like, oh, we got to get the hell out of here. Now, the Americans, again, there's only 2,500 troops on the ground, and everybody keeps saying different planning. The minute the Americans start bringing in more troops to organize to get people off the ground, Taliban sees it, they start doing their thing. So it was a really tough position that Biden administration was in. You hear the people say, "Oh, they should have kept Bagram Air Base. It would have helped the Afghanis." Look, Taliban didn't have an air force. Taliban didn't have all the big superpower running their supply lines, yet they were able to get control. So miss me with all this. We should have been giving them air support. The Taliban didn't have air support. What they had was a will to fight and a purpose. Again, it's not saying the Afghanis were cowards. They didn't feel like they needed to fight for this government they didn't want. The Taliban, on the other hand, had a purpose, willing to fight to the death. That wasn't the case of the government troops for Afghanistan. That's why, by and large, they laid down their weapons and made deals. The Biden administration, their intelligence told them that would happen at the earliest in 30 days after the Americans leave. They didn't know it was going to happen in a matter of days because they just start laying down. Okay. So at that point, you got always, oh, we should have kept Bagram. Bagram's 40, that air base is 40 miles from Kabul. So what were we going to do? That means you needed to have, they're saying we could have been flying people out of there. Yeah, but they have to get to that airport. And the Taliban controls all this, so that means more troops on the ground. That means bringing in more troops than the 2,500, which he has done. We're up to like 5,000. But again, the purpose is to get out. We've never had a clean exit from a country except for 2 times that I can think of. And those 2 times were because we totally and completely defeated those countries. There was no opposition on the ground. And we killed a crap load of civilians. That was Germany and Japan. We dropped a nuclear bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, just killing civilians. We did it in Germany. Bombing, we didn't drop nukes, but we bombed our crap out of cities. Read about the bombing of Dresden. We bombed civilians. We bombed these places into submission. There was a total defeat. So yeah, it was easier to do these things. The next thing, Korean War. Remember, war never ended. Stalemate. We still got, well, Trump has reduced the numbers. They went back up. So we usually would have 30-some thousand. I think we have 20-some thousand troops to this day in South Korea. That was since the 1950s. 1950s. Is anyone saying we should be in Afghanistan 65, 70 years? Okay, let's go forward. What is the one that people like to talk about? Vietnam. Okay, why are these things not the same? Close to 3,000 troops have died in Afghanistan in a 20-year war. The Vietnam War was about 14 years. 57,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War. When that helicopter flies off of the embassy roof in Saigon in 75, the NVA, they fought their way. They fought their way into Saigon. It wasn't like in Afghanistan where it was bloodless. They fought their way. It was active. So yeah, that pullout was crazy. But when you lose a war, and people don't like that to hear that in America because we're America and we watch too many movies and we like to believe the hype about ourselves in too many instances. Yeah, we have the most technologically advanced, well-trained military in the world, but that's their country. It would be no different if someone tried to invade America. It's like that old movie, Red Dawn. You're going to fight to the death to defend your own country, as opposed to, why are we here? Are we here to get rid of the Taliban? Are we here for 9/11? Are we here so women and girls can go to school? Why exactly are we here? Okay. So if you think motivation doesn't matter, it does. So again, Vietnam, those people were motivated to keep their country. We lost that war. Same thing happens here. You had a group that was motivated for their vision of their country, and another group that wasn't motivated of the vision of the country that we tried to hoist upon them. They didn't want that, so they didn't fight for it. When you look at all these things, you have to put all that together before you simplify and just say, Biden didn't do X, Y, and Z. Understand how many troops were on the ground when Biden came in. Understand what intelligence Trump didn't convey. And then about these SIVs, the special immigrant visas for the people who work with the Americans, there was a backlog of 17,000 of those applications when Biden came in. Why? Remember, Trump was limiting the amount of refugee visas we would give out. There's reporting out about this. Stephen Miller and these different people were pushing because they didn't want more of those damn Muslims in our country. So they slow walked that, made this huge backlog, and then everyone's, well, Biden, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? I want someone to show me what civilian airlift out of a war zone has been more successful in moving the amount of people we've moved out of Kabul, hundreds of thousands of people. I don't remember. I want to say it's at 200,000 or just under 200,000 people out of the country. Okay, real quick. So to get to these Sunday shows, I saw Chris Christie sitting up, and you'll see a lot of Republicans doing this, like, well, Biden said we weren't going to move any troops in. We weren't, till all Americans were out. That's not exactly what Joe Biden said. What he said is all Americans that want to leave. So the Republicans, Chris Christie knows this, they know what the fucking quote was, but they're playing games. Then they're leaving out that caveat that Joe Biden did give, all Americans that want to leave, because some of those Americans are dual citizenship. They have family there. All of them don't want to leave. So all of those Americans who are still in Afghanistan aren't all there because they couldn't make it to the airport. Many of these are people who did not want to leave. And again, for the Americans, back in March, April, Biden administration started telling Americans then, get out of the country. Okay, get out. So could they have done some things better as far as maybe get the loans to help people who couldn't afford it, the communication? Yeah, they probably could have. And again, I'm not saying Biden is blameless, but when you listen to even some liberals, but especially these Republicans, and I'm going to get to the media in a minute, these Republicans, you would just totally think all Biden, all Biden, all Biden. The media. Why do I think the media is being lazy in their reporting? Because they know they are partially culpable in what's going on in Afghanistan right now. Why? Because by and large, our mainstream media that is supposedly liberally biased were cheerleaders for the Bush administration leading up to 9/11. Leading up to the invasion of Iraq. Like, as I said earlier, one of the only media news organizations that was pointing out the BS about the whole invasion of Iraq was Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! because most people, the New York Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, they were all, it's time to stop debating and support the president. Amy Goodman and her people were reporting back then, which we now know going forward from investigations, that look, their sources were telling them back then that people from the Bush-Cheney administration were coming in, fixing the intel, telling the people in the intelligence community, intelligence that backs our view of wanting to invade Iraq, play up that intelligence. Intelligence that does not fit with that narrative, downplay it. And that's what they did. They cherry picked the intelligence. So you'll hear people say that it was an intelligence failure about not finding weapons of mass destruction. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. They had intelligence telling them that stuff was wrong. They chose to ignore that intelligence. So the news media went right along with them, cheerleading for the war, not being very critical in their coverage. So now they want to be hypercritical in their coverage because they know this is partially their fault as well, as in addition to not really reporting on what's been going on in Afghanistan over the last few years with the type of vigor that they needed to. I know this was long, but it's not an easy subject. It's not a simple subject.